Hello, students. This week we're going to be focusing on chapters 9 and 10 of our textbook, which are on gender and sexuality. And so, like some of the other areas of identity that we talked about this semester, gender is one, and sexuality are ones that um, were kind of placed into these boxes based on cultural and social norms. We're expected to behave in certain ways, and when we sort of act out of compliance with those expectations, there's a question of, is this normal or okay? And so the chapter starts with making a distinction between gender and sexuality. And so even though sometimes they're used interchangeably or to explain the same type of thing, the sex of a person is generally regarded as the biological makeup or the chromosomal sex. So it's very biologically based. Whereas gender is usually more of a social construct that we sort of place on those, biological sexes, I guess. And so the definition of sex is strongly influenced by the binary view of you're either born male or female, which excludes any individual who may be born intersex, which intersex is having biological characteristics of both sexes. And so this is something you're going to learn more about in the human sexuality course, but there are different type of intersex individuals. Some, it's on a chromosomal level. Some, there are external or internal sex genitalia that are characteristic of both sexes, or what genitals are on the outside don't match what's on the inside and things like that. And so there's different types of intersex individuals. But when a child is born, actually even before a child is born, we're feeling this pressure to assign them to one of two categories. And so, people will, what's the gender of the baby? Find out the sex, and they'll have like gender reveal parties and things like that. And so they know before the moment of birth. And even individuals who don't know until the moment of birth, there's sort of this announcement of, a doctor or nurse saying, it's a girl, it's a boy, right? And so when babies were born, that, at that time, it was clear that there was some ambiguous genitalia, or it wasn't possible to really determine whether the child fit into the categories of male or female. Parents were pushed by medical professionals to do something about that. So to have some kind of surgery or something like that, and select a gender for the child. And again, this is something that you'll learn more about in human sexuality, but there is a really well-known case where actually of twins that were both assigned male at birth, but there was an accident that happened during the process of circumcision. And so the doctors recommended that they raise that child as a girl. They corrected the genitalia to make the child appear female, and they tried to socialize and norm the child as a female, but that child never really felt like that was a match for them. And in fact, there was a psychologist who was working with the twins who was very abusive to them, and so made them engage in things that were not okay, and were really harmful to the twins. And so as that twin grew up, he ended up identifying as a male, and had gone through all of these traumatic experiences simply because, either the families, the medical professionals, or whatever could not handle having a child that's genitalia didn't match exactly what they believed that a male's genitalia should be like. And now this, of course, was not a child who was born intersex, but it kind of demonstrates one example of the ways in which we kind of make these decisions for babies that may not actually fit what the baby grows to identify in. And so there are some changes more recently where, surgery is, being put off, and doctors, medical professionals, and parents are being more accepting of the fact that their child may not fit into these two binary options. And so when we think about gender as being something separate than the biological sex, gender is viewed as being constructed within a culture and is understood within the binary framework of their biological sex. It's really a complex phenomenon and refers to the roles an individual performs within these cultural and psychic senses. But again, as time has gone on, more and more individuals have become accepting and affirming to the notion that only two genders don't exist either. And so even though we can say biologically, maybe there's three, male, female, and then these different types of intersex individuals, gender is this huge spectrum, right, of identities that we can hold. And so again, this is something that's changing. We're learning more and more language associated with this, as you know, with different pronouns and things like that. There are even some countries who are officially recognizing it as well. And so it's really important for therapists to be up to date with rapid changes that are happening, like in terminology and things like that. And so, it's not always possible to know all of them, but to have a good idea of the general concept. So if the client does bring to you a term that you're not familiar with and you say, oh, I'm not familiar with that term, and they tell you what that term is, you can say, oh, okay, like that makes sense. So it's not the client educating you fully, maybe just kind of letting you know about a new term. But it's important for us to try and stay on top of, new research and things like that as well. Wherever possible, in this textbook, they emphasize the dominant discourse effects on gender and sexuality on persons rather than looking to the classical gender and sex binaries. And so it kind of opens it up a little bit more. The chapter goes on to talk about gender discourses for boys and men, and then gender discourses for girls and female. And so a lot of this you're going to know, it's just different ways that we socialize children to be a male or a female. And so you can note the differences, and it talks about different studies, such as one study where adolescent boys scored higher than girls on only one item of a shame inventory assessment. So across the board, the girls who took the assessment scored higher on shame. The one area where boys actually scored higher than the girls, was I feel shame when I cry. And so when we look at the area that focuses on gender discourses for girls and women, there was a study that identified that messages that were received, lessons that were received by college-age women while they were growing up, was to be nice to others, be a good student, to be respectful, helpful. And at the bottom of the list are things like be a good leader, make a difference in society, master a skill, share your point of view. And so you can see how, males and females can be socialized very differently, and that ends up playing a big part. There are also some facts that are included in here about issues in the workplace where, women are more often interrupted than men. They're more often have lower level jobs, lower paying jobs, things like this. And so there's actually two videos that are posted on the module page for these chapters, this topic, that are a trans woman who is talking about her life as a man and what she realized in her life as a female were the differences. And so I think that that highlights a lot of the things that are talked about within this chapter. There's also a breakout box on heteronormativity. And so if you're not familiar with this, I encourage you to read it. It's on page 242. It's the assumption that heterosexual relations between a man and woman is the natural order of things. And so it's when we automatically assume, when we see a wedding ring on a person, that they're married to an individual of the opposite sex, or that we, make assumptions about how household duties are separated and things like that. And so the ways, and it also in the box, it kind of talks a little bit about some of the shifts with within heteronormativity as well. It also talks about, I'm sorry, in the female section about some women will adopt what can be called the cool girl image. And so kind of buying into those, or I guess not buying into those stereotypes, but trying to buy into things that males would say are what they want from a woman. And so this is talked about in Gillian Flynn's book Gone Girl. And so anybody who has seen the movie, I don't know that it's expressly talked about in the movie, but it is definitely in the book. And I remember this, that she talked about, being the hot girl. I mean, the cool girl. It means being hot, brilliant, funny, loves football, poker, dirty jokes, but also aligns with all of those, feminine characteristics of never getting angry, only smiling, letting their men do whatever they want, things like that. And so there ends up becoming this immense burden of individual guilt and self-depreciation because of that. I'm trying to be different than these, stereotypes and expectations. And at the same time, I'm also buying into the expectations of what men would want from me. And then there's a breakout box about ongoing inequities in the workplace and talks about that issue a little bit further. Next, the next section talks about gender intersectionality and the ways that it intersects with multiple other identities and makes an impact. And so it kind of talks about how diverse experiences within the male identity or female identity make it really hard to put individuals into a specific box. And so, obviously the experience of a white woman is very different than the experience of a woman of color. So even though there would be considered like a marginalized or oppressed status as a female, being a white female certainly has more privilege than being a female of color. Next, it talks about something called gender essentialism. And so what the essentialist perspective is, focuses a lot on the biological perspective of their psychoevolutionary basis. And so the differences between men and women are really biological at the source, and focus on that versus the socialization that is done or anything else, in relation to culture or other lenses. There's a breakout box on the patriarchal dividend. And so it's common for men to downplay their advantages over women, which plays into the hegemonic pattern. Next, it talks about gender entitlement. So gender discourses have often been solidified into dividing lines and unevenly empowered men with greater agency and choice. And so I think I've talked about this before, that, there's this like gendered hierarchy, and, male gender identity sits at the top of it and has the most privilege, and then it trickles down from there. And so sexism, like racism, really depends on those assumptions of superiority and inferiority. So men are superior in all of these ways, and that's why they sit atop of things and they get more opportunities and more pay and things like that. So the challenge for counselors is to help men recognize how gender discourse has placed them in an unearned position of social privilege, which becomes so familiar that an exaggerated sense of entitlement in their relationship with women becomes unquestioned. And so it's just there. It is what it is. And again, this is something that those TED Talk videos, specifically the second one, touches on about, it's not enough for men to create opportunities for women or allow women to have opportunities, but what if they were to give their opportunities to women and not take them? And I know that I'm not saying that as eloquently as the individual in the TED Talk did, and so definitely watch that. The next section talks about patriarchy and its implication for mental health professionals. And so this is sort of the meat of the chapter that gets into how it impacts our work and the way that we interact with clients. And so, of course, the mental health field has had a history of supporting patriarchal behaviors during the helping process. And so we talked about this with terms of race, and it is true with terms of gender as well. And so from a feminist perspective, patriarchal and Eurocentric practices systemically silence women who do not conform to those dominant cultural norms. A number of researchers have continued to express concern that gender awareness in therapy has not adequately been addressed. And so it's something that we can continue to look at. And so recently, researchers have encouraged supervisors to train therapists to recognize cisgender privilege, whether it's their own or others, as well as heterosexual privilege, and what do those grant us? And so again, it kind of goes back to what we talked about in the beginning of the semester with the privileged and marginalized client and counselor. And depending on our identities in this area, we may have levels of privilege that our clients don't have, or vice versa. And then also the recognition that gender entitlement doesn't only hurt women, it also hurts any gender, because it sets up this really uneven, oppressive playing grounds. And many men in the United States are really constrained from showing vulnerability and being emotional and all of that. They feel like they can't, and they're limited because it wouldn't be considered masculine of them. So some selected counseling problems that arise from this, this dominant problem discourse is violence, abuse, and harassment. And so looking at the field of counseling and therapy for its failure to address the issues of patriarchy that continue to lead to these environments, the expressions of gendered power relations that are evidenced in male violence and its effects on the psychological experience that women have, really have been a focus of this criticism. And so, you know, if, you know, even if a woman has not been assaulted or harassed or anything like that, the fear of it happening, because it is a very real phenomenon that happens to so many people, is always there. And so they behave in ways that are very different than men might in certain situations, because they feel like they have to protect themselves. And also the domestic violence enacted by men, or the domestic violence often we think of as a man on woman phenomenon. And this is not obviously always the case. Sometimes it could be women on men, men on men, women on women, or, you know, other gender identities as well. And so it's really important to pay attention to the fact that, you know, like, we're not minimizing it if it is two men or two women or a female on a male. Next is pornography. Women's bodies are more sexualized and objectified than men's. And this objectification has influence on, you know, really every part of our lives. And so, you know, the chapter goes on to say that some pornography can be experienced as empowering and educational, and even assist sex partners to enrich and enliven their sex lives. However, there is strong evidence that other forms of pornography, which tend to be the more mainstream, is very misogynistic and destructive to both men and women, and what their views on sexuality and how to treat one another are, or even how to take care of themselves. One of the most difficult issues for therapists to address with couples is pornography use, because where is the line between healthy and unhealthy, and how do we navigate that conversation? And so honesty between partners is really very important to alleviate any mistrust. And couples who use pornography together communicated better about their sexual relationship. And so being able to have that communication and kind of come together on, you know, mutual decision making. And so therapists may be able to help couples establish an agreement about whether, how much, and what circumstances this might be consumed. And also help intimate partners recognize that most people's bodies and sexual interactions bear little resemblance to what is being depicted in porn. And so to counter damaging, unrealistic expectations that porn may engender. So kind of going into it knowing that that is an issue. Couple more breakout boxes within these areas is about work harassment, intimate partner violence. It gives a lot of statistics about different behaviors. And then another breakout box on the pervasiveness of pornography. And so talking about the growth of this industry, and it really is a lucrative industry. I mean, in all honesty, I mean, it's, you know, billions and billions of dollars, I think, or millions of dollars, but huge, huge industry. which makes it very pervasive. Next, the chapter talks about body image, physical attractiveness, and physical well-being, and the ways that these really impact gender and gender differences. Many findings indicate that a large portion of women are dissatisfied with their bodies and constantly monitoring their weight and dieting. And so, where is this coming from, and how is our culture supporting this? Females are becoming more concerned about their weight at younger ages. Beauty is prominently connected with thinness here in the United States. Sociocultural constructions of the female body and expectations of physical and sexual appeal lead to negative experiences for women. We can imagine low self-esteem, body image issues, restricted eating, and eating problems. Cultural standards for the feminine body are virtually impossible to attain. So women feel shame about their bodies and internalizing these standards and thinking they have to meet these certain standards that are nearly impossible. And so because cultural standards for the female body are virtually impossible to attain, there ends up being this widespread body shame and leading to greater consequences for women's well-being versus men's, even though that can definitely have an impact as well. Body-related concerns appear less significant among ethnically diverse women relative to white women as a whole. Of course, this is true across the board. Women who identify as a sexual minority tend to report less concern for physical appearance and less drive to be thin than heterosexual women. And issues pertaining to body dissatisfaction have led to an enormous increase in plastic surgeries for women. And so they tend to be the ones who get this more. Now, body shame is not solely a woman issue. Looking at men, adolescent boys are particularly very prone to negative self-assessment in their bodies and often engage in unhealthy dieting. Some have resorted to fasting, use of laxatives, and purging, just like women have. They're less often concerned with overall weight and more concerned with muscle definition and avoidance of what might be considered flab or fat on their body. Men with physical disabilities often struggle to a great degree with negative body image because they're not able to command the same physical strength as able-bodied males do, and this is an expectation that we as a society have for men, and so it becomes a stronger issue there. So some selected counseling issues often pertaining to men is traditional masculine attitudes and adherence to traditional male roles are associated with more negative outcomes, including anxiety and depression, relationship difficulties, anger. A connection between male socialization and reluctance to seek help, where men only seek out therapy about half as much as women do. And men are less aware of their feelings and more and present with like issues related to like work and stuff like that, where these feelings may be underlying it or having an impact. They may not directly come out with that. So some therapists may view male clients as impenetrable, difficult to work with, or resistant because they're not able to tap into those emotional places as easily. Other therapists may unintentionally view men who seek therapy in negative terms based on traditional notions of masculinity. And still others may fail to consider how counselor expectations may align with men's worst fears. And so how are we checking our bias related to that? Some researchers have argued that therapy is too reliant on feminine modes of intervention that require verbal expressivity, vulnerability, and emotional awareness, which are often very difficult for men in our society. Again, not across the board. But newer therapies should be developed that are more congruent with these masculine styles so that they help assist men who are not able to verbally express emotions quite as well or even tap into them. And so therapists should pay closer attention to the culture of masculinity as a means of working more effectively with men and families. And so therapists can easily ignore enormous variation in men's attitudes and behaviors and unwittingly reinforce notions of men as passive participants in their lives. And so again, not falling into that trap. It's important to note how the relationship between counseling problems and gender influenced lives is an ongoing sociocultural issue. And the therapist has a responsibility to pay attention to family and public safety as an important goal when individuals have participated in violence and abuse. And so again, across the board, not looking at specifically how gender relates there and recognizing what our gender bias may be. Providing therapy to these individuals requires specialist training to navigate safety concerns along with the clinical needs of this population. When individuals engage in violent, coercive, or forced non-consensual sexual acts, mental health professionals must ensure that the victim voices are prominent and present in the therapeutic work and work closely with the criminal justice and legal systems. The success rate for treatment of IPV are not good. And so what can we be looking at to do differently in these areas? It's obviously difficult when ongoing violence is occurring to engage in counseling and help. Often couples will want to stay together even when there is painful violence and abuse present. And so how can counselors intervene and help clients or these type of couples? Some therapists become motivated to help clients exit the relationship when violence is ongoing, but it can be frustrating for those same therapists when the clients are not able to escape, or the therapist may feel like they're resistant to escaping, but it may be that the client is not able to, they're not equipped to, they don't have the support or things that they need to be able to do so. And so just taking that into account. The textbook continues to talk about out of control sexual behaviors. They abbreviate this OCSB, which can also be, a part of treating individuals and families, couples. It talks a little bit about, the use of these as unhelpful or unhealthy coping mechanisms. And so how can we teach them healthier coping mechanisms to deal with stuff so that they don't act out in those ways? In this area, there were some breakouts on the utilization of counseling services by men and women. So that's a great breakout to kind of see some of the differences. If you want to take a look at that on 265. And then the textbook goes back into selecting counseling issues often pertaining to women. So a lot about anxiety-related disorders, affective stress, relationship problems. They're more likely to be diagnosed with a mental disorder, more likely to prescribe medication. It's important for us to pay attention to the sociocultural effects of mental health issues in women, or how those things are impacting them that we're sort of calling mental health related disorders. Young women tend to feel isolated from one another as they kind of go into puberty and don't celebrate those milestones as much as men do. And so how can we create a culture about where women can come together and share information on going into the puberty process and developing in that way, so that there can be an increased closeness and not feeling quite so isolated during that time period. Looking at menstruation as not a negative and debilitating event, but, ways in which it's very natural, obviously, and not stigmatizing it as much as it has been. Talks a little bit about how some of the culture within our society kind of brushes up against this idea of the multicultural movement, because like challenging our current cultural views, even if they're unhealthy, may be seen as a negative thing. Therapists who unquestionably support particular ethnic traditions without consideration of gender and sexual inequalities can be complicit on ongoing subjugation of women and among immigrant cultures. And so having a recognition that things are going to look different for different people. Counselors' promotion of women's rights within a counseling relationship may inadvertently subject those clients to more risk. Therapists must be careful and wise in helping individuals to be removed from potentially lethal situations, and consultation with others is really important. Therapists have a critical role in normalizing the wide range of emotions that people might feel after rape and sexual assaults. Normalizing their reactions by trying not to intrude or push on their privacy, or requiring them to share things they're not ready to share. A gentle, careful, respectful exploration of the current concerns of the victim is required, allowing the client to set the pace without rushing them to disclose, and enabling them to experience a sense of control. And then finally, the chapter talks about counseling interactions. And so when mental health professionals name some of the gendered patterns of identity construction for male and female clients, they're taking the first step towards ensuring the negative patriarchal attitudes that do not dominate in the counseling room. There needs to be acknowledgement that in many communities, the devaluing of women is a common occurrence. Therapists need to continue to update their knowledge of the biological, psychological, and sociological factors that uniquely impact men and women. And when cultural traditions emphasize strong patriarchal assumptions, men and women are ascribed distinct roles within the family and the community. Whenever gender issues arise in counseling, other identity factors are also likely to be at play. And so how can we make sure we're looking at those intersectional identities instead of just gender? Therapists can use a deconstructive approach towards the impact of gender discourse on clients. So through deconstruction, astute therapists can support the discovery of alternative discourses, which allow for both personal transformation and also reconstruction of the new understanding of how to be in the world as a gendered being. All right, for this next section of this video, we're going to be focusing in chapter 10 on affirming gender, sexual, and relational diversity. And so this is abbreviated in the textbook as GSRD, so gender, relational, or gender, sexual, and relational diversity. And so one thing that's really important to remember is that the language you use has a really important impact on clients' thinking. And so, you know, language and how we use it is, I feel like, impactful overall. And it really speaks to what feelings we have that underlie those concepts. And so when we're working with clients, we should be really mirroring their language and kind of checking terms with them rather than just kind of coming up with our own or using our own idea of what that is. And so there's a breakout box at the beginning of the chapter on queer theory. And so queer, that word initially meant was different, unusual, strange. But it was used then as an insult towards individuals who were not heterosexual. And so queer became this insult, this pejorative term that was used. But people with marginalized sexual and gender identities actually sort of reclaimed the word and used it as a symbol that we, you know, don't necessarily have to identify within, you know, a specific category of, you know, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, you know, like that we can just be who we are. And, you know, one of the things that you're going to pick up even more so in the human sexuality course in this one is that we're changing the terminology to affectional orientation versus sexual, because it's not about your sexual behaviors. I mean, those are personal and everyone has different sexual behaviors that may or may not be determined by their affectional orientation. But what queer theory kind of does is it's also this idea that you don't need to know about my sexuality and what I choose to do. Like, I don't really have to answer that to anyone. And so queer theory disputes the idea of normal sexual preferences. It critiques the dominance of heteronormativity, which we talked about in the last chapter. It calls out heteronormativity and tries to break down the power of popular cultural narratives by destabilizing them. An alternative to thinking and speaking in terms of dualisms like gay, straight, male, female, it's just sexual diversity. Doesn't have to be any more specific than that. Talks about the move from fixed and binary to fluid and spectrums, which we also talked about in the last chapter. So versus like gay, straight, male, female, like what is the long continuum of identities that individuals can have, and not feeling like people have to be like boxed into this dichotomy or binary identities. Talks about generational differences and the ways that past generations may have seen these ideas and the way new generations see them, and how this can sometimes be a sticking point. between generations about these identities. And so the book says that counselors can support families by identifying the dynamics and facilitating communication so that, intergenerationally there can be more understanding. And so it might be useful to guide clients and family members to useful websites or helpful information that they can use, supportive online communities, things like that. Also, co-investigating some web content during sessions that can be talked about and processed through. There's a point to discuss on 281 that talks about the gender unicorn infographic. And this one can be a helpful one to help you understand identities that's similar to the genderbread man, if you've ever heard of this. And so I do encourage you to look at these things. And so again, this points you to the gender unicorn. The issue that has been brought up with both of those, so I'll talk about the gender unicorn since it's in here, is that why does our sexuality or affectional orientation or gender identity have to be likened to a mythical creature? That doesn't feel okay. In addition, it doesn't fully capture all the nuances of these identities. And so there are ones that are a better fit. However, for people newer to these concepts, it's really a lot easier to kind of get a basic understanding of the gender unicorn or the genderbread man prior to moving into something more less concrete, I guess. And so they can be helpful and useful in some ways. They're just not always the best. And so the genderbread man was also created by, it was made popular by a cishet white male who kind of took ideas from other people and didn't necessarily acknowledge their credit, and people from the community. And so there's some distaste for that model. But again, it can be helpful for someone who really doesn't have a good idea and just kind of help give the basics. And so again, that's something that's going to be explored more in human sexuality course. Next, it talks about prejudicial dominant discourses. And so people with gender, sexual, relational identities that are different may be considered sort of not normal, not following those normal patterns or whatever. And so there could be this myth that is put out there that they're trying to like buck the dominant culture and, like kind of stir things up versus them truly just wanting to, be who they are. And so there are also different myths that really perpetuate within this, or myths that perpetuate about this community and how they should be, or where they came from, or what specific things like quote, made them be like that, which of course we know that we are who we are, right? No one made us the way we are. Or I should say nothing made us the way we are. Identity, invisibility, and erasure. I think this is an important topic because it's when we're not able to see our identities in the dominant discourse. And so, if I identify as, within GRSD and I can't find characters in books or TV shows or movies or around me anywhere that also identify in that way, it's going to feel very lonely and isolating. And when there are discourses out there that say like, oh, why do you have to be so public? Why do you have to be in people's faces? Why can't you just keep that in your bedroom? Whereas those things wouldn't be said to a heterosexual couple engaging in those same behaviors. That's invisibility and erasure, right? Trying to get rid of it. Therapists can play an important role in recognizing and validating the many identities that clients embody, right? There is also, and I think this chapter gets into it, there's also invisibility and erasure within the LGBTQ plus community. And so there can sometimes be stigma towards people of color within the community, which is really important to note. People of color sometimes feel like because I'm queer, I don't fit into my people of color category, and because I'm a person of color, I don't fit into my queer category. Like they just don't feel like either place is welcoming or affirming to them. Similarly with bisexual individuals, a lot of times both within the community and outside of the community, there's this belief that you're either gay or straight, and right now you just haven't decided yet, and that's why you're bisexual or pansexual, one of those identities. And also within gender. So sometimes the community can push aside trans individuals and those who are gender non-conforming because it's different than sexual or affectional orientation. There can also be a lot of discrimination by the medical and mental health communities. And so, whether it's, having things separated between, genders and only having sort of a room for male and female on intake forms, having someone have to check a box for their gender or sexual orientation and not having a wide range of options or like a blank line that somebody can fill in. But even historically, there's been a shameful history of collusion with institutions of political power within the psychiatric community. Therapists can counter these marginalizing effects by helping the clients deconstruct notions of normality and mental health and illness. Also brings up the topic of conversion or reparative therapy, which has been used to try and change an individual's orientation. These have been known to be harmful and even deadly to individuals. There are actually currently only 9 states that ban the use of these with youth, none that ban them overall. There may be some counties, like for example, Florida is not a state that bans it, but there are some counties within Florida that have it banned. This is not something that the ACA approves of. They actually have statements that condemn this reparative therapy because of how harmful it is. Next, it talks about pathologization. Can't really say that word. Medicalization, objectification, and activism for these communities. It talks about the ways that the DSM can and has historically really hurt the community from homosexuality once being a diagnosis and having gender identity disorder. Now it has a new name that's a little bit more fitting, but just really pathologizing people's identities, right, at the core. Talks about the value of this community and how important it is to, if your clients are not connected to a greater community of GSRD individuals, that could be helpful to get your client involved in. But I know not everybody has an interest in this. And again, some marginalized identities. Oh, here it is, where it talks about identities that can be marginalized even within those communities. And so it's important to be able to recognize it and address the fact that your clients might have issues or have had historical issues with the community. Next, it talks about intersectionality, which we've talked about, kind of throughout the other chapters so far, but this week's discussion post is focused on intersectionality. And so it does talk a little bit more about how this plays out with gender as being one of them. One of the things I like about this chapter too is it has a lot of cases, real life cases that you can read. There's a pop-out box on sex positivity on 288. Again, something we're going to talk a little bit more about in human sexuality. Families of origin and families of choice. And so because a lot of times GSRD individuals have been ousted from families, disowned, things like that, they may have to create a family of choice. And this causes a problem where those families of choice may not have access to medical decisions and things like that, and may not be able to help their family of choice as much as you would family of origin and things like that. So there's a lot of issues still there. It talks about LGBTQ and aging. This is, only 2 paragraphs in here, but this is a much bigger issue that, one with the AIDS and epidemic of the 1980s, there was a loss of a lot of gay males. And so that cohort, that age group of males from that time period, has a lot of individuals have been lost. And so they may not feel as much of a sense of community as they get older, because, you know, as people get older, they start to lose more and more people. But also, because older individuals tend to rely more on friends and partners, often of a similar age, they may all kind of be having similar issues and not be able to help each other the way that they could. You know, historically, LGBTQ individuals weren't allowed to adopt, or, you know, they weren't seen as fit parents, so they may not have relationships with children that could help take care of them. They often had lower incomes and less education because of prejudice and you know, awful practices and things like that. And so they may not have the resources that they need as they get older. There's a lot of health disparities. There's lots of issues within nursing homes. I did some research on that. You know, basically, people having to go back into the closet because it's not safe to be at nursing homes, or they're, you know, have to be separated from spouses or partners because of going into older age homes. So therapists can help older LGBTQ plus clients by connecting them with needed services and also advocating politically for this population. Talks about parenting. And so there can be some internalized biases because of maybe rejection from their own parents or family. Therapists can help to deconstruct dominant discourses about who can be a parent, what kind of parent they can be. Therapists can challenge any internalized prejudice regarding child rearing, describe research on outcomes for children raised by GSRD parents, maintain lists of medical, legal, and mental health providers who provide affirmative care, things like that, to be supportive. The next topic gets into gender identities and practices, transgender, non-binary, and intersex communities specifically. It has some issues that people in this community face due to discomfort and distress, with how they're, you know, being forced to live, or the boxes they're being placed into. Also, you know, the belief that they're not real. Therapists have to identify alternative discourses to highlight gender spectrums and uncoupling gender identity from physiology. And so, you know, just because your body isn't that way, it doesn't mean that you aren't. Things like that. Should medical transition occur, you know, helping clients through that process so that it can be more successful and helpful for them, you know, even helping during a transition process while they're maybe coming out to folks or starting to socially transition and medically transition, and how they can deconstruct problematic discourses suggesting that they have to transition in a specific way and not the way that they want to, and not feeling like less trans or less like, you know, that gender because of what they choose to do or not do, like hormone surgery. Different areas of social transition, gender markers, name changes, things like that. Making sure that you're aware of the WPATH standards, which again, you'll learn more about in human sexuality. Therapists need to continue to act as gatekeepers, unfortunately, specifically for surgeries. Some providers request letters for hormones as well, but making sure that we're not standing in the way of that unless the individual does have other issues that are present that need to be addressed first. But you know, helping the individuals have informed consent on the decisions that they're making, and kind of guide them through the process. It also talks about gender diverse, transgender, and gender diverse children and their parents, and ways to navigate this with different clients, different support groups, and ways that you can normalize things, support the parents, normalize their feelings, which could be, you know, grief or fears related to their child's, you know, life and what it will be like. They can offer guidance to better outcomes, and you know, having the parent involved more in the acceptance of the child so that they can have those better outcomes. Again, love this chapter. It has these little breakouts of people's true stories, which is awesome. Also normalizing the client's experience of being trans, both by acknowledging broad impact on their life, as well as recognizing that it is not their only identity, that they hold lots of identities. Talks about why trans individuals might come to therapy that is related to their trans identity, and also recognizing that that's not always why they're there. Therapists may offer family or couple counseling to partners and family members as they adjust to maintain supportive relationships. There could be groups, things like that. Talks a little bit about non-binary and genderqueer and what that means. It's a little vignette. Important thing is for therapists not to make assumptions about a client's gender identity and to make sure you're asking if you're unsure. Intersex diversity of sex development, having a good understanding of this, helping clients with diversity of sexual development to know that they're not alone. There are others out there, even though it can often be hidden, and to deconstruct prescriptive gender and sexual binaries. Next, it gets into some behavioral things like sexual identities and practices, lesbian, gay, bisexuality, asexuality, and BDSM and kink. It breaks down these categories a little bit about what they are, what issues are common in these different communities, and how therapists can intervene. This does talk about like bi erasure and stuff as well. Talks about concerns of the LGB clients in general. So looking at the socio-political history is very important. And so there are definitely some documentaries you can watch on this. You can watch some stuff about Stonewall. Even though this is sexual and affectional identity, looking at a documentary for gender disclosure is a new one that is really great. Talks about the impacts of homophobia on individuals' lives and how therapists can be supportive, coming out as an individual choice in a multifaceted process, and recognizing that this is not a one-time event, that coming out can be constant as you meet new people, feeling like, are they somebody that's comfortable to come out to, and stuff like that. Talks about asexuality as a spectrum and recognizing that asexuality is not in and of itself a disorder or an issue if the person identifies that way and they're happy with it. And there's also a spectrum of asexuality, so not assuming what a person may or may not want because of that. One of the breakout boxes in this chapter, or its points to discuss on 307 from Butler about trying some of these exercises. So like buy an LGBT magazine and read it in public. You know, how do you feel? What do you notice? Go for a drink in an LGBT club or bar, and entering an LGBTQ space, if you are not, you definitely want to be very careful with that because you don't want to invade someone's safe space and make it an unsafe space for them. Wear an LGBT shirt or badge, hold hands with someone of the same gender person in public, keep your heterosexuality in a closet for a week by ensuring you don't give it away in conversation. So like if you're partnered, you know, talking about your partner or your spouse versus your girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, wife, not using their pronouns, things like that, to kind of hide it and see how that feels for you. These are actually really good things that you can use in the sexuality course for your experiential activity. So things to think about. Talks about the BDSM kink community. There is some more information online that you can get about, you know, and workshops and trainings if you are a therapist who's going to work with this community, but having a basic understanding so that if a client you're meeting, you know, anyway, ends up disclosing that they are involved in these communities or these sexual practices, or decides they want to become involved, you're not just like, oh, we've been doing therapy for all this time, need to refer you out, but having some basic knowledge so that you can help and guide them through that process. And recognizing that BDSM is not necessarily just like reenacting abuses, but that, you know, there's so much more to it than that. And there's a lot of communication and contracts, and it's actually probably a bit of a healthier thing than most sexual interactions and sexual behaviors are. And so there's a lot of information. It also talks about, you know, some books and movies that are not appropriate, like 50 Shades of Grey trilogy, which became very popular, kind of put BDSM into the forefront of the conversation, but it depicted it very inaccurately. And so people got the wrong idea about this community. It talks about therapeutic considerations for working with individuals in BDSM and kink communities. It talks about polyamory, swinging, and hookup culture. And again, some things to remember about this community, ways to challenge your biases about this community. And it says, consider visiting a local BDSM kink club. I would not advise that. I don't feel like it's okay to be a tourist in a situation like that, where there is so much vulnerability and an expectation of safety. And so kind of inserting yourself in a community that isn't one that you identify with isn't always the best for those individuals. But it talks about some things to consider working with these populations, and how different it can look, what the differences are between polyamory as like an overarching title, but then there's like swinging or the lifestyle, there's polyamory, there's consensual non-monogamy, there's different ways that it looks. And so you might hear that from clients about different specific ways that looks like for them. But again, this is important. Communication, how breakups are dealt with. That jealousy, doesn't mean that they shouldn't be a part of the lifestyle. Jealousy just may be a normal reaction. And you might just need to help the client work through that. Talks about the hookup culture and the changes within that, friends with benefits. Also looking at the sexual double standard and the slut discourse. This is like literally what my dissertation was on. I could write a book about it, because I kind of did. My dissertation is my book on it. But what this looks like on college campuses and outside of it. Looking at therapeutic considerations overall, so it kind of puts everything together as an affirmative therapy and non-pathologizing stance, self-awareness, educating yourself, recognizing the influence of social and cultural environments, awareness, but don't overemphasize those issues if they're not a part of it. Don't make everything about that. Looking from a strengths perspective, how to deal with coming out in session, sexual health, condom use, HIV health, education, stigma. All of these things, again, will be helpful when you get into the human sexuality course. How to create a GSRD friendly environment. I love that on 321. If you have a say in your paperwork, when the therapist is part of the community, how to handle this, has a nice conclusion and right up at the end. And so lots and lots of information in these two chapters. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I know there's a number of podcasts and everything up there if you're able to listen to any of them. Those two TED Talks, like I said, are really great, and I hope that you have a chance to look at them. But the podcasts are great as well. So that's it for this week. See you next time.